Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on lifespan development. In today's lecture, we're going to be focusing upon adolescence. Now, there's a few things to kind of be mindful of here. First off, adolescence is not a monolithic experience. Rather, it encompasses a hugely diverse range of experiences that that's influenced by a person's individual differences, their cultural context, as well as a lot of environmental factors. And some of you may have navigated the challenges of puberty, while others may be grappling with questions of identity and autonomy. Now, regardless of where you are on your journey, understanding the intricacies of adolescent development can really provide some valuable insights into both our own experiences and those of others around us. So through this lecture, we're going to dive into adolescent psychology, examine some of the key theories, a little bit of empirical research, and how this all ties together to help people navigate this very difficult time in life. Now, in today's lecture, I want to kind of outline a few things that we'll be exploring, because we're going to cover the biological development first off. We're going to examine some of the biological changes that occur during adolescence. Specifically here, we're going to think about puberty as a hallmark of this stage. And this really brings about some significant physical transformations as the body matures from childhood through to adulthood. And so we'll explore some of the hormonal shifts, the brain maturation, and sexual development that goes on during this period, and the role of things like genetics and nutrition and environmental influences on shaping that biological trajectory. We'll then explore a little bit of the psychosocial development, because adolescence is not merely a time of physical growth, but also a time of profound psychosocial development. And so we'll dive into some of the psychological dimensions, the social dimensions, and explore the theories about identity formation, peer relationships, family dynamics, and the quest of being an autonomous, independent person. And we'll also explore, of course, Freud's concept of the genital stage and Erikson's theory of identity development as we explore this whole psychological terrain of adolescence. We'll also take a little bit of time to look at the neurobiological perspective, because there's some remarkable changes in structure and function that lead to some shifts in the way that adolescents think, their emotional regulation, as well as their decision-making processes. And so when we draw upon some neuroscience research, we can begin to explore the neural mechanisms underlying the risk-taking behaviors, the impulse control, and social cognition during adolescence. And then finally, we'll explore a little bit of the psychopathology and the questions of resilience, because not everything goes right all the time within adolescence, as you well know. Adolescence is a time of growth and exploration, but it's also a place that's marked with a lot of challenges. Things like mood disorders and substance abuse and self-harm. And so we'll examine some common psychopathological issues that arise during adolescence, and we'll consider some risk factors as well as some protective factors that contribute to resilience and psychological well-being. And by exploring all the intersection between all of these, hopefully we'll have a better sense of how to help people as they navigate through this period of adolescence. But before we dive into that, I do have a little story that I want to tell you about an important researcher. James Marcia, born in 1937. He's a Canadian-American psychologist. It's renowned for the study of identity development. In fact, in my own studies, Back in the day, he was one of the most important researchers that helped me to understand adolescence. He taught at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia and then moved to State University of New York at Buffalo. And through his career, Marcia's research has really kind of focused on understanding how individuals navigate those complex processes of identity formation. And if we take the work of James Marcia and Erik Erikson together, we get this beautiful picture of how adolescents function, how they transform. Because Erikson argues that this time is a time of identity versus role confusion. Marcia takes it a step further and dives into, well, what kinds of identity statuses can there be? And he outlines some, and we'll take a deeper look later on in the lecture, but the fascinating thing is that he looks at it and goes, okay, well, some people can be what he would call identity diffusion. Don't really have a particular commitment to a particular role. They aren't committed to kind of finding out who they are. And then there's people that are identity foreclosed. They commit to something that is already set. Then there's identity moratorium, where people actively explore. They try on one identity and then they try on another identity. And they kind of experiment with different roles and beliefs and relationships. And then there's finally identity achieved. Generally, what happens is when you go through that experimentation process and finally commit to your identity, even though you've kind of probably mixed and matched things that other people would say don't go together, you become a much more resilient person. And so the goal, according to Marcia, would be to be in identity achieved, but that's kind of a lifelong process. And adolescence is kind of the beginning of that process. So let's dive into the basics of adolescence, and then we'll work our way back through to identity in adolescence. So when we look at adolescence and adolescent psychology, and we think in terms of the biological development, we always come back and we think about puberty and hormonal changes. And puberty really represents a critical milestone in adolescent development. It signals the onset of sexual maturation and the transition from childhood through to adulthood. And here, hormonal changes play a central role in orchestrating the physical transformations that occur during puberty. We have the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the gonads all interacting to regulate the production of sex hormones such as estrogen and testosterone, which are responsible for the development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics. And while puberty typically occurs during early adolescence, its onset and progression can actually vary wildly among individuals. Factors like genetics and nutrition and socioeconomic status, as well as environmental stressors, can influence the timing and the tempo of pubertal development. So, for example, early maturation in girls has been associated with various psychosocial challenges, including body image concerns, peer relationships, and risk-taking behaviors. And we always, of course, need to kind of remember that it isn't nature or nurture, it's both. And in addition to the genetic factors in adolescent development, environment influences the shaping of this biological development in puberty. So exposure to things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, such as those that are found in some plastics and some pesticides, have been linked to alterations in hormone balance and pubertal timing, as well as stressful life experiences such as childhood trauma or family disruptions can also impact the onset and progression of puberty, underscoring the interplay between biology and environment and basically causing children to mature into adolescence and into adulthood before they're really ready. And so you can kind of just see that there are some things that have some significant interplay here. Now, when we look specifically at puberty, we see that there is this cascade of hormonal events that orchestrate the development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics. And this marks the onset of reproductive maturity. And when we think in terms of hormonal regulation, the hypothalamus in the brain really kind of begins to produce gonadotropic releasing hormones, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release gonadotropins, including follicle stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones. And these hormones play a crucial role in stimulating the gonads, which are ovaries for females and testes for males, to produce sex hormones such as estrogen and testosterone. So there's a cascade of hormones that goes on here. And this fluctuation in the hormonal progression is far more than there will be at any other time in the life, the kind of adult mature life of an individual. And so this is a time of profound change as far as sexuality goes. First off, there's the development of primary sexual characteristics, things that are related to reproduction and include the development of reproductive organs. So in females, things like growth and maturation of the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. And in males, primary sexual characteristics encompass an enlargement of the testes and the scrotum and the penis. And then there are also the secondary sexual characteristics, things that aren't related to reproduction per se, but distinguish males and females typically. And these secondary sexual characteristics include things like breast development, widening of hips, and the onset of menstruation. And for males, it includes facial and body hair growth, the deepening of the voice, and increased muscle mass. And the timing of puberty really varies widely across individuals. And as something I've already mentioned, it's that interplay between genetics and environment and sociocultural factors. On average, girls typically begin puberty between the ages of 8 and 13, while boys typically start between the ages of 9 and 14. So early onset of puberty in girls has been shown to be something that is associated with various psychosocial challenges. There's going to be some challenges there. And this whole pronounced physical change that goes on in the onset basically of sexual maturity triggers questions of how do I deal with this? Who am I? What is my identity? What is my sexuality? How do I relate to others now? And adolescents can experience significant fluctuations in mood and self-esteem as they try to navigate the transition from childhood through to adulthood. And I want to kind of just take a little bit of time and really hone in on that whole question of early experiences in pubertal timing. Because researchers have shown that stressors experienced during childhood can impact the onset and progression of puberty. And there's several types of stressors that are linked to alterations in pubertal timing. So, for example, childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse. So studies have found that there's an association between experiences of childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse and early onset of puberty in girls. So basically, the theory goes that traumatic experiences during childhood can disrupt the normal functioning of what we call the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and that leads to an accelerated pubertal development. And other researchers has argued that father absence during childhood may be associated with early pubertal timing in girls. And the absence of a supportive father figure can impact psychosocial stress levels, potentially influencing hormonal regulation and pubertal onset. And environmental factors such as exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, we've already talked about those as well, they've been implicated in altering pubertal timing as well. So there's a lot of mechanisms that seem to go on here. If you may have taken another class with me, you may have heard of me talk about the HPA axis, which is basically how our body responds to stress. And that is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which ties in very closely with the HPG axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And the HPA axis produces cortisol as a response to stress, but cortisol isn't really good for your body in the long term. So when there's chronic stress, that starts to disrupt the HPG axis, which impacts pubertal timing. And that's kind of part of how that system kind of gets thrown out of balance. So stressors early in life can play a role in the biological development of adolescence. And that's just something to kind of be mindful of. Also, the social context between pubertal maturation is something that we need to kind of be mindful of. So, for example, family dynamics. The family environment exerts really a profound influence on the adolescent's experiences of puberty. So, for example, parental attitudes, how they communicate about things like sexuality and body changes can shape the adolescent's perceptions and feelings about their changing bodies. If a parent is open and communicative and supportive and well informed, then this can be an enjoyable time. But if the parent is not informed or is not communicative or just simply says, here, read this book, then you're going to have an adolescent that is lost, confused, does not feel supportive. But when there's supportive and open communication within the family, that can foster a positive sense of self-esteem and body image. While negative or stigmatizing messages like, oh, all sexuality is bad, is going to contribute to feelings of shame or embarrassment, as the adolescent inevitably is going to be struggling with issues of sexuality because the hormone levels are at least 3 times what they are for an adult. So, of course, they're going to be thinking of sexuality, and they may be feeling like they need to repress this or deny it in some way, which is a shame. Also, peer relationships. Peers become increasingly important during adolescence. They serve as a source of support and validation and social comparison, and pubertal timing may influence an adolescent's social standing within the peer group, as in those who mature earlier or later than their peers may experience feelings of difference or exclusion. Sometimes it can be a benefit to mature early. Sometimes it can be a benefit to mature later. But it completely depends upon the relationships and the societal context. Now, in many societies and cultures, puberty is celebrated as a rite of passage marking the transition to adulthood, while others see it as kind of a silence or a taboo time. But societal messages are still going to be there. There's going to be messages about what's ideal beauty, what is the ideal gender role, what does sexuality look like, and the adolescent needs to figure all of that out. Then, of course, there's gender differences, and gender here is going to play a significant role in shaping an adolescent's experiences of puberty. Boys and girls may have different experiences in puberty and timing and physical changes and social expectations. The other thing to keep in mind here is there are those people that are intersex, or others that have different gender identities, and that is going to be a time of significant, for some it can be a physically dangerous time to be their body being transformed, particularly if they have genetic variability that's both male and female. So for some people it can be extremely difficult, but for the vast majority, this is a time of figuring out their maleness or their femaleness, and how they're going to embrace or define the quote-unquote gender that they will be kind of living with. Now, I want to also explore a little bit of the neurobiological structure of the adolescent brain, because this is really fascinating. You need to kind of be mindful that the adolescent brain undergoes a series of structural and functional changes that shape the cognitive, the emotional, and the behavioral processes. There's been a lot of neuroimaging studies that reveal that adolescence is characterized by continued synaptic pruning. You know, if you're not thinking in certain ways, then you're going to lose those ways of thinking. There's also myelination, that is, there's that your neurons become a little bit more insulated and begin to fire a little bit better. There's also refinement of neural circuits. The connections become better. And particularly this happens in regions implicated in higher order cognitive functioning, what we call the prefrontal cortex. This is your abstract thinking. This is what really makes you human. This is your moral reasoning center, your planning center. And so as these changes happen, the adolescent is going to realize, oh, I'm thinking new thoughts. I must be the first person to think these thoughts. And they're going to realize that their parents don't have all the answers. And so there will be some challenges there. Now, I want to kind of dive in a little bit more specifically to the prefrontal cortex, because we think about this as the executive center of the brain. And it really starts to develop, but it doesn't fully develop. And it only fully develops if you kind of avoid substances, and if you are physically kind of engaged in the world. And if you do these things, by the time you stay relatively healthy, by the time you're about 25, then it's fully developed. But it takes time. Now, what the prefrontal cortex is responsible for is things like impulse control. So in early adolescence, there's going to be some struggle with impulse control. There's decision making. So there's going to be trouble with the decision making, planning, goal-oriented behavior. All of these things are things that take some time to develop. And as the prefrontal cortex matures, adolescents demonstrate improvement in cognitive abilities, things like abstract reasoning and planning and perspective taking. Now, just behind the frontal lobe, because you think of the frontal lobe as just behind your forehead there. Just behind that is your limbic system, your reward processing, which is kind of your emotions. So the limbic system, which includes structures like the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, plays a crucial role in emotional regulation and reward processing. It also ties in with and is critical to addiction. So that can kind of be something you need to kind of be aware of. So during adolescence, the limbic system undergoes structural changes and increased sensitivity to rewards and social cues. And this leads to heightened emotional reactivity and susceptibility to peer influence. Now, this is something that's important to kind of think about. If your executive area, the part of you that says, no, stop, don't do that stupid thing, is your frontal lobe, and it's not fully developed, but your limbic system is very sensitive to rewards and addictions, and you start giving it addictive substances, then you're going to very quickly find that the earlier this starts, the worse you're going to have the ability to stop and say no. And so that can start a very risky cycle. Now, the other thing to kind of be mindful of here is that there's risk-taking behavior. Because you have that imbalance of the development of the prefrontal cortex, which involves impulse control and decision making, and you have that heightened reactivity of the limbic system that contributes to the adolescent propensity for risk-taking behavior. Adolescents throughout history have been known to engage in sensation-seeking activities back to BC times. They have been described as being wild and impulsive and peer-driven in their behaviors, and they navigate the complex world by kind of taking risks and looking for the thrill. So you need to kind of be mindful of that. That's, to some extent, part of that is just the basic neurobiology of an adolescent. And that is why there's such a vulnerability there. So while adolescence is a period of heightened plasticity, that is, heightened change and heightened capacity for learning and adaptation, it's also a time of increased vulnerability to these influences. And so experiences during adolescence, things like trauma, or things like substance use, or things like chronic stress, can shape brain development that has a lasting effect on cognitive and emotional functioning. And so understanding the neurobiological underpinnings of adolescent behavior has some important implications for interventions and prevention efforts. And so we need to kind of be mindful of when we're dealing with an adolescent. We're not dealing with a adult. We're dealing with someone whose brain is experiencing some really wild changes and is developing very quickly, but it's also very sensitive. And we need to treat them accordingly. Now, I want to kind of just dive in just a little bit more and look just a little bit more at the whole idea of the neurodevelopment and perspective on risk-taking. Because adolescence is this period by having increased experimentation, increased sensation-seeking and impulsivity, and you have things like substance use, reckless driving, engagement in risky sexual behaviors, and the reward processing here. The adolescent brain exhibits heightened sensitivity to rewards due to this increased activation of the basolimbic dopamine system. Because dopamine is what kind of gets us going and gets us enjoying things. And this plays a central role in the experiences then of pleasure and motivation. And so heightened sensitivity to rewards can drive adolescents to seek out novel and rewarding experiences, even in the face of potential risks. Because the parts of the brain that go, hey, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't do this, are not fully developed yet. And there's also things to kind of be mindful here as far as peer influence goes, because there's a social part to the brain that's undergoing significant development during adolescence, and this leads to increased sensitivity to peer influences and social cues. And peer relationships play a crucial role in shaping an adolescent's attitudes and behaviors, including their willingness to engage in risky activities to gain peer approval or acceptance. And remember that the prefrontal cortex, that area responsible for executive functions such as impulse control and decision making, continues to develop through adolescence, and it is not fully mature until early adulthood. And so this developmental imbalance between the reward-seeking system and the still developing prefrontal cortex can continue to lead to impulsivity and poor decision making. And then there's also a lot of neurotransmitters going on and hormones going on. Remember, the hormones are way higher than they are for an adult. And neurotransmitters and hormones kind of function together. And there's some key neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, norepinephrine. Each of these play some critical roles in mood and reward processing and impulse control. And when you have fluctuations in neurotransmitter systems during adolescence, this too can lead to risk-taking behaviors as well as susceptibility to peer influences. And then you have the hormonal changes. For example, the increase in testosterone levels, that's also going to contribute to heightened risk-taking tendencies. And one of the things you can kind of keep in mind is that the amount of testosterone that a person has really does a lot to shape how much sexuality their brain thinks about. And when you think about an adolescent having 300 times what an average adolescent or adult male has of testosterone in their system, you can tell just how much thinking of sexuality is going on within this individual, this adolescent individual. And so you need to kind of understand that these are just simple biological realities that these people are living with. Now, of course, it isn't just those simple things that have to contribute to the developmental trajectory of risk-taking. But when there is this pattern that gets set in adolescence, it does seem to exhibit persistent patterns of risk-taking behavior into adulthood. But there are things that also play into it, like temperament and genetics and family dynamics and sociocultural influences. All of those things go to interact with the neurobiological processes to shape the individual's differences and the risk propensity that is there. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and explore a little bit of psychosocial development and psychosexual development and cognitive development. Specifically, I want to look at Freud and Piaget here. Now, if you remember, Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis that really conceptualized the development through a series of what he called psychosexual stages. And of particular relevance to adolescence is what is called the final stage in Freud's developmental psychosexual stages, which is the genital stage, which Freud proposed is the stage that where the sexual impulses and desires are finally focused upon the sexual organs, and where there's a focus on establishing intimate relationships and pursuing adult roles. And so Freud here emphasized the importance of resolving unresolved conflicts during the earlier stages, particularly what he called the Oedipus and Electra complexes, which involves feelings of attraction toward the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same sex parent. And successful resolution of these conflicts leads to feelings of attraction towards the opposite sex parent and rivalry to the same sex parent. And when you have successful resolution of these internal conflicts going on within the child, this leads to the development of mature sexual identity and the ability to form healthy, intimate relationships. So while Freud's theory does have some controversy, we can really admit that a focus upon genitals in adolescence is really a thing. And that is something that is just simply recognized as being part of the reality of the psychology of adolescence. Tied in with this and is the cognitive development of adolescence. And with Jean Piaget, who was, remember, that pioneer, that Swiss pioneer that developed the cognitive developmental theory that emphasizes the qualitative shifts in thinking that occur during adolescence. Now, according to Piaget, adolescents transition from concrete operational thinking, which is characterized by a focus on tangible, concrete experiences, to formal operational thinking, characterized by abstract reasoning, hypothetical thinking, and the ability to engage in systematic problem solving. And the formal operational stage represents a significant milestone in cognitive development and enables adolescents to think critically about some complex ideas and engage in hypothetical deductive reasoning and consider multiple perspectives on abstract concepts, which they weren't able to do. And that is because of this massive change within the neurobiological structure, particularly of the prefrontal cortex. And so Piaget's theory highlights the importance of intellectual maturation and the capacity for abstract thinking in shaping adolescence. And this, of course, ties in with moral formation as well, because now the child or the adolescent is able to think in abstract principle terms. And when you tie all these things together, you start to understand the adolescent and understand that the adolescent is grappling with tasks of navigating both biological urges and cognitive transformations. And all of this serves to establish a sense of self, to create the ability to form intimate relationships and make meaningful eventual contributions to society. So while there's a lot going on here, it's a wonderful and exciting process. Now, one of the things that I think is most important in adolescence is what Erikson highlights in his stage, which he calls the identity stage, where the adolescent is dealing with that whole question, who am I? And according to Erikson, the identity stage occurs during adolescence, so we have this roughly between 12 and 18 years of age. And during this stage, adolescents grapple with the task of forming a coherent sense of identity. And this encompasses, what are my values? What are my beliefs? What are my aspirations? What roles do I have within society? And this is the primary psychosocial crisis during this stage in life. It's that conflict between identity versus role confusion. And central to Erikson's theory is the notion that the adolescents engage in the process of exploration and experimentation as they seek to define themselves and establish a sense of identity. And this exploration may involve trying on different roles and values and identities, as well as questioning societal norms and expectations. And adolescents may explore various identity domains, and that might include academic interests, vocational interests, religious interests, ethnic interests, sexual interests, all in a quest for discovery. So don't be surprised by it. That is part of the process. Now, successful resolution of that identity crisis eventually will lead to development of a clear and coherent sense of identity. And this can be characterized by a stable sense of self and a sense of direction for the future. And adolescents who have achieved identity may demonstrate a strong sense of purpose and self-confidence and commitment to personal goals and values. Now, in contrast, individuals who experience role confusion may struggle with feelings of uncertainty and identity diffusion and difficulty making decisions about their future. Now, Erickson here really emphasizes the importance of social interactions and also cultural influences in shaping identity formation. So he makes it clear that family dynamics, peer relationships, cultural values are things that the adolescent should explore in their construction of identity. And so when you have supportive relationships from family members and peers and mentors that can facilitate that exploration of identity, it really provides the adolescents with a sense of belonging and validation and makes that crisis that they have to go through that much easier. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, someone that ties in deeply to adolescence is the work of James Marcia. And so I want to kind of circle back to his work as well, because it dovetails nicely into Erickson's identity versus role confusion. Remember, Marcia was someone that focused his research upon understanding how adolescents navigate that whole process of identity formation and how they grapple with concepts of self and values and life goals. And he identified these as, okay, what is the identity status within the individual? So you have identity diffusion. And I want you to kind of think about your own adolescent experience. Where were you? Or maybe where are you now? What status might you be in? So identity diffusion is when an individual hasn't actively engaged in exploring their identity. They haven't committed to any specific role or value. They just are kind of there. They feel uncertain about their future and they lack a clear sense of self. They're not committed really to anything. People in this identity state of identity diffusion, they may lack direction or commitment. They may seem disengaged or apathetic, and they're really just kind of trying to protect themselves. They may show little interest in exploring different options or trying on new experiences, and they might avoid activities that require any long-term commitment or investment and instead prefer to stay in their comfort zone. And in these relationships, adolescents with identity diffusion may struggle to establish deep connections or intimacy, or they may hold on very deeply to that deep connection or that intimacy as a way of kind of calming the rest of the stress in their life, because they do have to eventually try to figure out this identity status. Then there's something called that identity foreclosure. Maybe you weren't someone in identity diffusion. Maybe you were in identity foreclosure. In identity foreclosure, you make a commitment to a specific role or value without engaging in any meaningful exploration. This is what your family did. This is what your society expects. This is what is normal. Therefore, this is what I will do. I will commit to this without the exploration. Now, this is good and bad. This is good in that it gives you a place where you can say, okay, that's what my identity is, but it's not a fully developed identity. It is a rigid, externally defined identity that when these external barriers are taken down, that identity can easily be lost. So there's some danger to it. So adolescents in this state of identity foreclosure seem to appear confident and self-assured, but their sense of identity is often based upon those external influences rather than on the internal exploration. They simply have decided to conform rigidly to societal or fulfillment expectations, and they adopt predetermined roles or beliefs without questioning their validity. Now, in this case, their interests may be narrow as their choices are dictated by preconceived notions and of what is acceptable or desirable. And they may seek out relationships that reinforce their predetermined identity, surrounding themselves with individuals who share their values or beliefs. But they may struggle to connect with people who challenge their assumptions or push them to explore new possibilities. Then there are those that are in moratorium. And moratorium, I would suggest, is the place that you want your adolescent to be. Even though they're going to change the hairstyle every week, they're going to change their hair color every week, they're going to be have piercings one week, and they're going to be all clean cut the next. It's going to be very confusing. But the status of moratorium is active exploration of identity options, without making firm commitments yet. And individuals that are in moratorium, they experiment with different roles and beliefs and relationships, and their behavior in moratorium is actively engaging in exploration. It's about experimenting with different identities and roles and interests and searching for a sense of self. They may appear adventurous or curious and open-minded and eager. They may demonstrate a wide range of interests and hobbies. They may even appear flighty at times. But they're going to have diverse social circles. They're going to engage with people from different backgrounds and perspectives. And when they finally commit, they will be much stronger. And that is where you have identity achieved. And identity achieved is basically after moratorium, when you commit to your own specific individual identity. The final status, identity achieved, occurs when individuals have explored various options and made commitments based upon personal values and beliefs. And they have developed a coherent sense of self and a clear understanding of their identity. And adolescents who have achieved a sense of identity exhibit a strong sense of self and clarity about their goals and values. And they are confident in their abilities and decisions, and they can approach life with a sense of purpose and direction. And they pursue activities and interests that align with their authentic selves, feeling a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in their pursuits. And they may demonstrate resilience in the face of challenges, draw on their sense of identity to navigate adversity and setbacks. And the relationships will be meaningful relationships based upon mutual respect and trust and understanding. And so they will have a capability of intimacy and vulnerability and forming of deep connections that the others do not have. And that is what we can thank James Marcia for, to see that while some may struggle at certain points in adolescence with this identity, sometimes that struggle has a reward in it. And that it's not good to avoid that struggle, because that struggle can lead to a very strong, resilient adult. Now, there are, though, challenges in adolescence. And the psychopathology, the mental health issues in adolescence are prevalent and evident. And I want to highlight a few of those. We're not going to dive into any depth with them, but it's important to be aware of them. Anytime you're working with adolescents, you need to be mindful of these disorders. And you should ideally be an expert in these, because these will come up again and again and again. And if you don't understand them, then you don't really understand a lot of the struggles that happen in adolescence. First off, there's depression. And in adolescence really is a peak period for the onset of depression. And with this, you have symptoms such as persistent sadness, loss of interest or pleasure in activities, changes in appetite or sleep patterns, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, and thoughts of self-harm or suicide. And factors such as hormonal changes, stress, academic pressure, social isolation, family conflicts, and genetic predisposition can really contribute to the development of depression in adolescence. Then there's also anxiety disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and panic disorder. All of these are common among adolescents. And symptoms may include excessive worry, irritability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, a physical symptoms such as muscle tension and fatigue, academic stress, social pressures, family dysfunction, traumatic experiences, genetic factors that may contribute as well to the onset, because at least a third of the population is genetically predisposed to being very susceptible to things like anxiety and depression. Then there's also substance abuse. We've talked a little bit about why substances can be such a huge risk factor due to the neurobiological development in adolescence. And adolescence is, of course, a time of experimentation. And many adolescents will engage in substance use as a way to cope with stress and cope with peer pressure or emotional difficulties. And substance abuse can include the misuse of things like alcohol or tobacco or marijuana or prescription medications or illicit substances, and sometimes just household products. And the risk factors of substance abuse in adolescence are, things like genetic vulnerability, family history, but it's the risk of substance abuse is so profound because this is such a sensitive time in the development of the brain that any substances that you introduce are going to impact upon that eventual growth and development. And you need to be mindful of the harm that is being caused there. Then there's eating disorders, things like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorders. These often emerge in adolescence, particularly among females. And symptoms may include a distorted body image, preoccupation with food or weight, restrictive eating patterns, binge eating episodes. And again, social factors that impact this, like perfectionism and low self-esteem, or things like trauma or family dynamics, can play into this. There's also self-harm, suicidal behaviors. Adolescents may engage in self-harm, like cutting or burning themselves, just as a way of coping with emotional pain or distress. But suicidal ideation, thinking of death, and committing suicide and suicidal attempts are also significant concerns during adolescence. And so all of these factors, relationships, trauma, bullying, family conflict, substance abuse, all of this plays into this. And then there are things like behavioral disorders, things what we call conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, where there's patterns of disruptive and antisocial behavior that violate the rights of others or societal norms. Symptoms like aggression and defiance and rule breaking and disregard for authority are all part of this as well. Now, I want to just take a moment and give a nod to G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was one of the pioneering figures in American psychology. And there's a term that he used to describe adolescence that I think is very apt, and we should probably remember it. And the coin is Sturm und Drang. Now, while he was American, he studied psychology in Germany, and so he was very good with German. So he called this Sturm und Drang, which is the German word for storm and stress. And what a great way to describe adolescence. It's storm and it's stress. It's a big thundercloud and you're stressed out in the midst of it. It's a lot of chaos and you're stressed. That is adolescence. So if you're in adolescence, know that adults view adolescence as, oh, what a crazy time. And probably wouldn't want to go back to it. And so, and as an adolescent, if you know that and know that you have things to look forward to in adulthood, just remember that, because this is a tumultuous time that's characterized by heightened emotional intensity, conflict with authority figures, and rebellious behavior. And so I think storm and stress really captures the essence here. There's that emotional intensity, mood swings, heightened sensitivity. It's a roller coaster of joy and sadness and anger and all the hormonal changes that are going on. There's a conflict with authority because you don't understand teachers, and yet your thinking is developing where it's almost there but not quite. And so you think you know better, but you don't really. And then there's identity exploration where you're trying to figure out who you are. You have peer influences that have an inordinate amount of influence upon you. And you have a propensity to risk-taking as an adolescent. So all of this can make life just a wild and crazy ride that you can characterize as storm and stress. So as we close out today's lecture, I want to highlight a few key terms. First one would be genital stage. And here, you need to kind of remember, this is the Freudian psychoanalytic theory. The genital stage is that final stage of psychosexual development proposed by Freud, where it's characterized by the reawakening of sexual impulses and emergence of mature sexual interests and behaviors in adolescence. So adolescents at this stage seek intimate relationships and strive to establish a sense of sexual identity and fulfillment. Okay? Formal operations. Formal operations is Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development that posits that adolescents are transitioning from concrete operational thinking to formal operational thinking. And formal operations involves the ability to think abstractly, engage in hypothetical reasoning, and systematically solve problems. Then identity versus role confusion. Remember, that is Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory that identifies the stage of identity versus role confusion as the central developmental task of adolescence, so that during this stage, adolescents grapple with questions of identity and exploring different roles and values and aspirations. And it's really the successful resolution of this crisis that leads to a coherent sense of self. So it's a very important task that an adolescent has to go through. And then finally, identity status, where James Marcia kind of breaks down that whole journey of identity into what status, in what way are you resolving that question? And he identified 4 possible states. Identity diffusion, where you aren't really engaging. Identity foreclosure, where you just choose a ready-made identity, but it's really kind of shallow. A moratorium, where you try on different kinds of things. For a period of time, you feel a little bit lost, but eventually, if you commit to a package of different traits, then you get to identity achieved. So then you become a more robust, well-developed adult. And as far as questions go, which theorist coined the term Sturm und Drang to describe the tumultuous period of adolescence? Yeah, we know that is, yes, G. Stanley Hall. It isn't Sigmund Freud, it isn't Jean Piaget, it isn't Erik Erikson. It is G. Stanley Hall. So, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And just to kind of close things out, I hope you really appreciate just how fascinating adolescence is. There's a lot going on biologically, psychologically, socially. There's a lot of theorists that have written a lot about this. And we, in all honesty, we're just scratching the surface here. But I think these are the key points that we need to understand in navigating adolescence and also in helping adolescents and working with adolescents in our future lives. So, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you in our next lecture when we dive into early and middle adulthood. You take care. Bye-bye.